Welcome to the AMSM channel. This content is prepared under the supervision of Arvin. Sometimes we do not fall in love with a real human being. Rather, we masochistically fall in love with the suffering of unattainability and playing the role of a heroic victim.
Wow. Yeah. It is it's an incredibly haunting thought to open with, just to kind of sit with that realization that the object of your affection, the person you're agonizing over, might actually just be like a prop in an internal tragedy you are writing for yourself.
Right. It really reorients how we look at heartbreak, doesn't it? Like completely flips it. And welcome to you, the listener, to today's deep dive. We are taking on a mission today that feels, well, a bit different from our usual
Yeah,
explorations.
much more intimate.
Definitely. We are basically going to perform a ruthless clinical autopsy on a single incredibly complex dream. We have this massive stack of clinical sources, case notes, psychoanalytic breakdowns, and what they do is they deconstruct this one specific nighttime narrative.
And it's fascinating because they show us how the human mind processes emotional trauma, like
Yeah.
how it builds these elaborate self-destructive defenses
Yeah, it
and how it
gets
desperately tries to prevent just a total psychological collapse.
it's intense. So the sources we are working with today, they basically serve as a roadmap into the absolute darkest, most repressed layers of the human psyche. We are going to decode this dream using several different lenses.
Right, because one lens isn't enough for something this dense.
Exactly. So first, we will look at it through classical psychoanalysis, which is the Freudian approach. Then we'll examine analytical psychology, so tracing the archetypes of Carl Jung.
That's where it gets really symbolic.
Oh yeah, big time. Then we will bring in cognitive schema therapy, which deals with our core, often toxic childhood beliefs. And finally, we will subject all of this to the cold, hard light of modern neurobiology. To truly understand this nighttime theater, we really have to look at it from every conceivable angle.
We do. But before we get into the heavy analysis, I feel like we need to lay out the raw events of the dream for you, the listener, just so you can visualize the space we were walking into.
Yeah, let's do that. Think of this as the raw footage before we send it to the editors, basically.
Yeah.
So here's the setup. The dreamer, who is a man, goes with his male friend to the house of a girl that the dreamer is deeply in love with.
Right.
Now, the crucial baseline fact here, and this is so important in his waking life, this girl is completely indifferent to him.
Which is key, right?
Yeah,
Because it means the entire dream is already built on this foundation of unrequited tension.
exactly. So, in the dream, they are in her house. She is lying down and she is pretending to be asleep. She isn't actually asleep, she is feigning it.
Which is such a specific detail.
It is, and the dreamer approaches her and tries to forcefully wake her up by tickling her. It's awkward, it's strained, it feels almost invasive, honestly. But then suddenly the dreamer's friend steps up and boldly kisses the girl on the cheek. And in response to this, the dreamer turns and violently punches his friend right in the face.
Just a massive, immediate physical escalation out of nowhere.
Huge. And then, as dreams do, the entire landscape just shifts. Suddenly, the narrative is that this girl is constantly traveling abroad, specifically to England.
Right, the geography completely changes.
Yeah. And the dreamer sees her sitting completely alone on the edge of a sheer cliff.
Yeah.
To reach her, the dreamer then goes through this agonizing, physically grueling process of smuggling himself across a border river.
Like an illegal crossing.
Exactly. The dream makes it very clear that it is illegal, it is dangerous, and he is suffering immensely just to cross this boundary. And then finally, the dream shifts one last time into what the clinical notes actually describe as a dream within a dream.
The nested reality layer.
Yeah, it ends with this hallucinatory, overwhelmingly happy scene of the dreamer and the girl just sitting by the river laughing together.
I mean, it really has all the elements of a classical epic, doesn't it?
Mm.
The quest, the betrayal, the impossible landscape, the final catharsis.
Totally.
But beneath that epic veneer, like under the surface, is a terrifying level of pathology.
So true. So let's start breaking down the casting choices the brain made here, because it feels like there are 100 different symbols screaming for attention. But the people in the dream are acting in very specific, very strange ways. Like, if I dream about my accountant, I always just assume I'm dreaming about my accountant.
Right, yeah.
But our sources suggest the brain doesn't actually cast people as themselves.
It doesn't. And I think the best framework for understanding the who of a dream comes from Carl Jung. Jung proposed this concept of archetypes.
Right.
In analytical psychology, elements in a dream, especially the people, are actually fragmented projections of the dreamer's own psyche.
Okay, so wait, he's not dreaming about his actual friend?
Not really, no.
Uh,
Jung diverged from Freud on this exact point.
yeah.
While Freud thought a lot of dream imagery was basically a disguise
Yeah.
to hide unacceptable urges from the conscious mind.
Like a sensor.
Exactly, like a sensor.
Yeah.
But Jung believed the subconscious was actually trying to communicate with the dreamer, like it was using a universal language of symbols.
So the subconscious, it casts people you know in roles that represent different fractured pieces of your own personality?
That is the core of it, yeah. The subconscious basically looks at its internal cast of characters and says, who in the waking world has the traits I need to represent this specific part of myself?
Right.
And the most prominent, arguably the most dramatic archetype in this entire sequence is the friend. In Jungian terms, this friend represents the shadow archetype.
The shadow. Yeah, I hear that term thrown around a lot in pop psychology, usually implying something, I don't know, evil or malicious, like a supervillain origin story waiting to happen.
Yeah, it often gets misinterpreted that way. The shadow is not inherently evil. It's not the bad guy.
Oh, really?
Think of it more as the psychological container for everything your conscious ego rejects. So, from the moment we are born, society, our parents, our schools, they all tell us what behaviors are acceptable.
Right, sit still, be quiet, be nice.
Exactly. We learn to be polite. We learn to hide our aggression, to temper our bold desires, mostly out of fear or shame. But all of those repressed traits, they don't just vanish.
You have to go somewhere.
They are stuffed into the shadow.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm getting this. If my conscious self is, say, incredibly timid, overly polite, and just terrified of rejection, my shadow is going to be holding all of my repressed aggression, my bluntness, and my raw desire.
Bingo. That's exactly it. And in the dream space, when the ego's control finally slips because you're asleep, the shadow gets to walk around and actually act.
Wow. Okay, this completely recontextualizes the first act of the dream for me. Let's look at the kiss again. The friend, who we now know is the shadow, walks up and kisses the girl on the cheek.
Yes.
On the surface, that just looks like a betrayal by a buddy, like, hey man, why'd you kiss my crush? But if the friend is actually the dreamer's shadow, then the dreamer is watching himself do exactly what he secretly thirsts to do.
Exactly. The dreamer's waking ego is paralyzed. It's paralyzed by feelings of defectiveness and fear. He cannot make a move. But the shadow is deeply pragmatic.
It just takes what it wants.
Right, because the shadow is not burdened by social anxiety or the fear of rejection. It simply acts on the raw desire.
That makes so much sense. But then the dreamer punches the friend in the face. This is the part that really trips me up. Because if the shadow is finally doing what the ego desperately wants but is too scared to do, shouldn't the dreamer feel, I don't know, a sense of relief? Why the violent attack?
That's the tragic part. The clinical autopsy of this dream reveals the dark reality of how deeply entrenched this man's repression is. When he throws that punch, he's not defending the girl's honor.
Right.
And he isn't acting out of standard jealousy either. That violent punch is a physical suppression of his own dark, pragmatic, masculine desires.
Oh, wow. He is literally beating down his own assertiveness.
Yes. His conscious ego is so fragile and so terrified of this raw, uncontrolled desire that it perceives its own shadow as a literal mortal threat.
Like an intruder.
Exactly. The dreamer cannot stand to see his own repressed desire manifested right in front of him. It violates his core internal rule that he is not allowed to be bold, that he is not allowed to take what he wants. So he attacks the shadow just to shove it back into the unconscious.
It's like hitting the alarm clock because you hate the time it's showing. The clock isn't the actual problem. The reality of the time is the problem.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
So is the dreamer essentially punishing himself for having the audacity to want what he wants?
That analogy hits the underlying mechanism perfectly, honestly. The violence against the shadow is a direct reflection of how brutally he polices his own desires in waking life.
That is so exhausting.
It is. The internal dialogue is essentially, how dare you act on this? We don't deserve this. We are too afraid for this. It's an internal civil war playing out as a fist fight in a living room.
Jeez.
And because he cannot integrate that shadow, because he cannot accept that he actually has bold, assertive desires, he remains completely paralyzed in his waking life.
I want to ask you, the listener, to just think about your own shadow for a second. Think about the person in your life, or even a character in your dreams who makes you incredibly uncomfortable because they are just a little too loud, or a little too reckless, or a little too forward. Are you judging them, or are you actually repressing the part of yourself that desperately wants to act just like them? It's a very, very uncomfortable mirror to look into.
It really is. It requires immense vulnerability to admit that the things we hate in others are so often the exact things we deny in ourselves.
Absolutely. So, okay, if his friend represents the repressed self, the shadow, what does the girl represent in this Jungian lens? Because as the dream progresses, she's not just a girl he has a crush on anymore. She's sitting on a cliff. She's constantly traveling to England. The geography around her feels, I don't know, almost mythical.
She becomes a mythical figure because, in Jungian analysis, she represents the anima.
The anima, okay.
Yeah. The anima is the feminine aspect of the male psyche. It's basically the idealized concept of connection, emotion, and life itself. But in this specific dream, the anima is manifesting as a perfectionist, completely unattainable object.
Right.
She is the idealized concept of reality that has slipped entirely out of his reach.
Let's talk about the imagery of the cliff then. Because the dream makes a huge point of placing her sitting alone on the edge of a sheer precipice. That feels very intentional.
It is. The cliff is a vital symbol in analytical psychology. It represents the razor's edge between rationality and madness. It is the absolute border of consciousness.
Oh, wow.
And when the dreamer sees her sitting there, totally isolated on the edge, the dream isn't actually giving us a psychological profile of her emotional state.
Because she is a projection of him. The cliff isn't hers. It's his.
Exactly. Her isolation on the precipice is his isolation. It represents the imminent danger of his own emotional freefall.
That is terrifying.
It's a warning. The dreamer is teetering on the edge of psychological ruin over this obsession. His mind is generating the image of the cliff to show his conscious ego exactly how close to the edge of a total breakdown he really is.
The spatial mapping of that is just incredible. He literally places his ideal of love on the very border of his own sanity.
Yes.
So structurally, we have the dreamer violently suppressing his own ability to act, punching his shadow, while simultaneously watching his ideal of connection teetering on the edge of madness.
That's the Jungian setup, yeah.
Jung gives us the cast of characters, but the sources point out that Jung falls a bit short when explaining the mechanical, almost bizarre behaviors the dreamer exhibits. Like, for the how and why of those actions, we have to pivot to Sigmund Freud.
Right, because moving to Freud takes us from the theatrical meaning of the characters into the raw, defensive mechanics of the mind. Freud viewed dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, specifically focusing on how the ego protects itself from trauma, anxiety, and unacceptable urges.
Let's use Freud to focus on the tickling, then.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Because out of everything in this dream, the tickling feels the most out of place to me. It is incredibly awkward. The dreamer is in the house, the girl is actively feigning sleep, and his response is to try to wake her by tickling her. If he wants her attention, why not just shake her shoulder? Why not yell her name? Tickling feels so regressive, almost like a child acting out.
You've keyed into the exact word the clinical texts use there. Regressive.
Really?
Yes. This is a classic Freudian displacement of libido.
Right.
And we need to clarify here that Freud didn't just mean libido as strictly sexual desire, but as the core energy of human drive, like the life force that pushes us toward connection with others.
Got it.
So the girl has completely sealed her emotional boundaries. By pretending to sleep, she is signaling that she is physically present, but psychologically completely inaccessible.
She's locked the door, turned off the lights, and is basically pretending she isn't home.
Perfect analogy. And the dreamer is absolutely terrified of direct, mature rejection. He knows that if he asks her for love directly, or if he shakes her awake and demands a real conversation, she will verbally reject him.
And he can't handle that.
No, that rejection would shatter his fragile ego. So the libido, that desperate drive to connect, cannot find a healthy outlet. It is forced to be displaced into an immature, regressive action.
Which explains the tickling.
Exactly.
Because it bypasses emotional consent entirely. If you ask someone a question, they can choose not to answer. But if you tickle someone, you force a physiological reflex, like they have to squirm, they have to laugh, they have to pull away.
It is a desperate attempt to extract an uncontrollable physical reaction from someone who has locked you out.
Man.
The dreamer is so starved for acknowledgement that his subconscious resorts to an invasive physical act just to force her to react to his existence without him having to face a mature verbal rejection.
That is so deeply sad when you really unpack it. He can't get her to voluntarily open her eyes to him, so he tries to force a reflex just to prove he has some impact on her physical reality.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate act of powerlessness masquerading as an action.
It is an ego defense.
Yeah.
It protects him from hearing the actual words, "I don't love you."
Right.
And the dream's defense mechanisms, they only get more elaborate and more desperate from there. The sources highlight something very rare that happens at the end of this sequence: the phenomenon of the dream within a dream.
Yes. Okay, let's get into this. So the landscape shifts. He goes through the agony of crossing the river. And then the text notes the dream shifts into the secondary layer, this hallucinatory, hyper-real, happy ending by the river. It feels like something straight out of the movie Inception. Why does the brain build nested realities like that?
According to Freudian psychoanalysis, a dream within a dream is a structural attempt by the unconscious to strip reality from a profoundly painful event.
Okay, how so?
Well, when the mind creates these nested layers, it's essentially the psyche's way of building insulation. It is the mind saying, the reality of this pain is too much to bear, so I'm going to push it down another layer.
Oh, I see. It's isolating the anxiety. Like putting a radioactive core inside a lead box and then putting that box inside a concrete bunker.
Exactly. The core reality that she doesn't want him, that she's unattainable, that he is completely alone on the cliff, that threatens to shatter the dreamer's ego completely. So the mind creates a buffer zone. It wraps the unbearable truth in the illusion of a secondary dream state.
And what happens in that secondary layer? They are just sitting by the river, laughing together, totally happy. After all the agony, the borders, the smuggling, the violence, they're just chilling. It feels incredibly unearned.
This is pure wish fulfillment.
Right.
The dream ends with this sudden, joyful reunion because the dreamer's psyche simply cannot tolerate the tension anymore. The reality of the waking world is crushing him. So the subconscious engineers completely hallucinatory, unearned resolution just to save him from a psychological break.
If I connect this to real-world medicine, it sounds exactly like a trauma surgeon administering a massive dose of morphine.
Yes.
The brain is literally injecting hallucinatory painkillers so that the shattered ego doesn't completely disintegrate upon waking up. It's a survival mechanism. The brain is calculating the damage and basically saying, if you wake up feeling the true, unvarnished weight of this rejection, you will break. You won't be able to function today. So I'm going to give you this fake memory of laughing by the river just to soften the blow.
Psychological morphine is the perfect description. The mind prioritizes survival over truth. It will lie to you, it will create elaborate fictions, and it will build nested dreams, all just to keep you functioning for the next day.
But if we follow that medical analogy, if you keep taking the morphine, you never actually fix the broken leg.
Exactly.
You just ignore the pain while the bone sets incorrectly and the infection spreads.
And that's exactly what happens. The short-term survival mechanism becomes a long-term poison. And that brings us to the architecture of self-sabotage, which our sources analyze through the lens of cognitive schema therapy.
I am fascinated by schema therapy. For our listeners who might not be familiar with it, what exactly is a schema? Like, how does it differ from a Freudian defense mechanism?
Good question. Freudian mechanisms are often reactive. They happen in response to immediate stress, like the tickling or the wish fulfillment. Schemas, on the other hand, are proactive.
Proactive.
Yeah, they're deeply entrenched, core beliefs we hold about ourselves and the world, and they're usually formed in childhood. They're basically the invisible blueprints that dictate how we interpret reality.
Give me an example.
So, if your childhood taught you that people always leave, you develop an abandonment schema.
Okay.
Every interaction you have as an adult is filtered through that blueprint. If someone is 5 minutes late, your schema says, see, they're abandoning me. And this dream is an absolute masterclass in toxic schema.
Okay, let's focus on the geography of the dream to understand these schemas then. Specifically, the detail of the dreamer illegally smuggling himself across a border river to reach the girl. The dream explicitly frames this as an illegal, agonizing, covert operation.
Yes, it's very specific.
Let's deduce what blueprint that reveals. If he's smuggling himself, that implies he believes there's a border patrol. He doesn't go through customs, he doesn't walk through the front door, he sneaks in.
The clinical texts identify this as a profound defectiveness and shame schema.
Defectiveness.
Yeah. The metaphor of smuggling is incredibly revealing here. The dreamer literally views himself as an illegal immigrant in the landscape of love. He is trying to enter the heart of a girl who has bolted her borders against him.
But why does he feel he has to sneak in? Like, who is policing this border?
He is policing it himself.
Mm.
People with a severe defectiveness schema believe they are internally fundamentally flawed.
Like they're broken at the core.
Exactly. They believe that if they try to engage in love, normally. Like, if they just walk up to the front door and introduce themselves, they will be rejected because they are inherently bad or ugly or unworthy.
So the only way they feel they can acquire love is to sneak in through the back door, to hide their true nature, to bypass the scrutiny of a healthy, open relationship.
You nailed it. And that leads directly into the second psychological trap we see here, the emotional deprivation schema.
Okay, how does that play out?
Well, the dreamer knows in his waking life and deep down in the dream that this girl does not love him. Yet he endures the absolute physical and mental agony of smuggling himself across this treacherous border river anyway.
Right, he suffers immensely for it.
This exposes a highly toxic internal belief about what love actually is. The schema is telling him that love cannot be natural and it cannot be freely given.
So the emotional deprivation schema basically convinces the individual that their emotional needs will never be met naturally by others.
Exactly. Therefore, love must be begged for, it must be bled for, it must be earned by crossing impossible hurdles.
So in his mind, if it's easy, it's not real love. Or, maybe more accurately for him, if it's easy, he doesn't trust it.
Right. The suffering becomes the proof of the love's value. If he isn't suffering, he isn't loving. He believes he has to pay a literal toll of agony just to exist in her presence.
Wow, this perfectly ties back to our opening hook. Masochistically falling in love with the suffering of unattainability. He is addicted to the obstacle course because the obstacle course validates his core belief that love is supposed to hurt.
And look at how the dream environment actively supports and validates this belief. Look at the girl's location.
She's constantly moving.
Yes. The dream has her traveling back and forth to a faraway utopia, England. She is never stationary.
Which activates the abandonment and instability schema.
Exactly. Her constant movement mirrors the subject's fundamental terror of being abandoned. His subconscious actively places the object of his affection in a constant state of fleeing.
Because he expects to be left behind.
His blueprint dictates that people leave, so he dreams of a woman who is literally always leaving.
I want you, the listener, to pause and map this onto your own life for a minute. Think about how often we unconsciously pursue people who are emotionally moving to England, people who are always just out of reach, who are inconsistent, who text back 3 days later, who keep us constantly guessing.
It's so common.
We tell ourselves we are just unlucky in love, or that we just happen to fall for complicated people. But maybe, like this dreamer, we are actively seeking out scenarios that validate our deepest, most painful schemas.
Because it's what we know.
Right. We chase the person running away because catching them or being with someone who actually stays would mean rewriting our entire internal blueprint. And the brain is absolutely terrified of that kind of change.
That is the core tragedy of schemas. We seek what is familiar, even if what is familiar is agonizing. The familiarity of the chase, the familiarity of the rejection, feels safer than the terrifying unknown of a healthy, secure attachment.
Which brings all of this to a head. All of this analysis, the shadows, the defenses, the schemas, it all culminates in one spectacular, glaring contradiction in the dream's logic.
It really is the paradox that reveals the ultimate truth of his condition. Let's just review the sequence of events with all these lenses applied.
Okay.
The dreamer risks his life, crosses dangerous borders, violently fights his own shadow, and endures immense psychological torture just to reach this girl who clearly does not want him.
And when he finally gets there, having achieved the impossible, what actually happens? There is no grand romance. There is no passionate declaration of love. There is no profound resolution to the conflict. They just sit by a river and laugh.
The contrast is staggering.
It is. The highest level of anxiety, law-breaking, and suffering results in a completely superficial, hollow interaction. Why go through literal hell for a chuckle by a river? It makes no sense.
It makes perfect sense if you realize that the goal was never actually true connection.
Wait, what?
The psyche doesn't actually want to catch the car it's chasing. The goal was to maintain a safe illusion.
Consider what that implies. The suffering is the goal.
Yes.
The agony of the chase, the smuggling, the borders, is preferable to facing the reality of a true relationship, which requires actual vulnerability.
Exactly. Sitting by the river laughing is a sterile, consequence-free fantasy. It's a hollow victory. The dream proves that the dreamer doesn't want the complex, messy reality of loving this woman. He wants the idea of her.
And he is willing to engineer the most elaborate mental torture just to preserve that idea, rather than face the grief of her actual indifference.
And this brings us to the unconscious warning. Because if the subconscious is engineering this elaborate theatrical production, it's also delivering a message, a wake-up call to the waking mind.
The sources identify a brutal, practical warning embedded in this dream, and I think it goes back to the very first scene. The girl is pretending to be asleep.
That's the key.
You can't wake someone who is pretending to sleep. If someone is genuinely asleep, you shake them. They wake up, they see you. But if they are pretending, they already hear you. They know you are there. They have made a conscious, active choice to keep their eyes closed to you.
The subconscious is screaming at the dreamer to stop. You cannot smuggle yourself into a closed heart. Trying to do so is chronic self-harm.
The violent punch to the friend's face, that is the dreamer hitting himself.
Right.
The agonizing border crossing, that is the dreamer torturing himself. The warning from the deep mind is clear. This addiction to the heroic victimhood, this masochistic pursuit of the unattainable, is destroying you. It is a closed system of pain.
It's a beautifully constructed narrative of psychological survival and self-destruction. The meaning-making apparatus of the brain is truly profound.
It really is. And I'm sitting here honestly buying into all this Freudian and Jungian poetry. It is a Shakespearean tragedy playing out in the theater of the mind.
It feels very complete.
It does. But there's a voice in the back of my head, and it's the voice of modern neurobiology screaming that we are completely overthinking a random neurological glitch.
Ah, here we go.
What if everything we just discussed, like the last hour of intense psychoanalytic theory, is totally 100% wrong?
That is the exact friction point where modern science meets classical psychoanalysis. The interpretation of dreams we've just done is heavily contested in the scientific community.
And as guides to this material, we have a duty to present the entire picture. Our sources contain an intense academic debate. So we are going to present the other side of this argument impartially, because you, the listener, need to see the full scope of how science views this phenomenon. We've covered the meaning-making side. What does the neurobiological camp say?
The primary counterargument comes from the activation synthesis theory, championed by researchers like J. Allen Hobson and Robert McCarley. And this perspective completely and utterly rejects both Freud and Jung.
So, no shadows, no animas, no displacement of libido.
None. In this view, there is zero hidden meaning in this dream. There are no archetypes acting out of play, and there are absolutely no deeply engineered psychological warnings being delivered by a wise inner self.
Then what on earth is happening? If it's not a message, what is the brain actually doing when it creates an image of a border river or a friend kissing a girl?
From an evolutionary neuroscience perspective, dreams are essentially just random electrical firings in the brainstem during the REM cycle.
Okay, break that down for me.
Let's look at the anatomy. During REM sleep, a structure in the brainstem called the pons begins firing off signals, releasing acetylcholine. It is a purely biological process, essentially an electrical storm in the deepest, most primitive part of the brain.
Okay, but how does a random electrical storm in the brainstem create a cohesive story about my friend, a girl, a cliff, and a border river? That seems way too specific to be random noise.
Here's how the mechanics work. The dreamer in his waking life is highly stressed. We know he's dealing with the anxiety of unrequited love. Because of this chronic stress, his emotional and memory centers, specifically the amygdala, which processes fear and emotion, and the hippocampus, which stores memories, are inflamed and highly active.
So the system is already running hot before he even goes to sleep.
Exactly. The neural pathways related to this girl, to his friend, to feelings of rejection are already primed. They are sensitive.
Right.
So when the REM sleep cycle begins, the pons starts firing these random electrical signals. These signals travel up and hit these highly active, inflamed memory centers. Boom. The memory of his friend is activated. Boom. Thought about the girl. Boom. An image of a border he saw on the news that day. Boom. A feeling of isolation.
Oh, wow. So it's just pulling random files from the hard drive that happen to be near the surface because he's stressed. It's not choosing them for a poetic reason. It's just hitting the files that are most easily accessible.
Yes. Now enter the forebrain. The cerebral cortex, particularly the frontal lobes, are responsible for logic, order, and narrative making. Even though parts of the prefrontal cortex are dialed down during sleep, which is why dreams are bizarre and illogical, the brain still hates chaos.
It wants a story.
It desperately tries to synthesize these random signals into a linear narrative. It stitches the friend, the girl, the kiss, the river, and the cliff into a story, simply because it is a meaning-making machine trying to make sense of the biological noise.
Let me make sure I'm fully wrapping my head around the massive contrast here. To the psychoanalysts, this dream is a masterpiece of metaphorical storytelling, carefully designed to protect the ego and deliver a warning.
Right.
But to the neurobiologists, it's basically just the brain's IT department randomly rebooting servers in the middle of the night and sweeping up the emotional debris left over from a stressful day. Like the narrative is just a byproduct of the reboot.
The clinical data from the activation synthesis side supports that exact intuition. And it extends to the very end of the dream, too. Remember the hallucinatory happy ending by the river?
Yeah, the wish fulfillment that Freud said was psychological morphine.
Exactly. If there is no psychological meaning, how does neurobiology explain the sudden dramatic shift to happiness at the end of the dream?
Yeah, how do they explain that?
It debunks the psychological painkiller theory entirely by looking at neurochemistry. In the activation synthesis model, that happy ending merely represents a physiological shift in the body.
Yeah, shift how?
Towards the end of the REM sleep cycle, cortisol levels, the stress hormones, naturally begin to drop, and the brain prepares to transition to a working state. The body biologically calms down.
So the sudden feeling of peace and happiness in the dream isn't a profound psychological resolution to an epic internal struggle?
No, it is simply the forebrain's narrative response to a literal chemical drop in stress hormones. The heart rate slows, the cortisol drops, the body calms down biologically, so the dream story is forced to become calm to match the physiological state of the organism.
That is significantly less romantic than the Jungian cliff of madness. It strips the poetry away entirely.
It does. But it is a robust, scientifically grounded theory of brain function. Is the dream a message from the depths of the soul, or is it just the forebrain writing bad fan fiction based on random electrical sparks?
The academic community is split.
Very split, and the evidence can be compellingly read in both directions.
And we leave it up to you, the listener, to weigh that evidence. Which lens feels truer to your own experience of the night? When you wake up in a cold sweat, are you visiting the shadow realm to battle your repressed desires, or are you just experiencing a biological reboot of an inflamed amygdala?
It's fascinating to realize that science still hasn't definitively answered what happens when we close our eyes.
The tension between those two ideas, meaning versus mechanics, is what makes studying the mind so endlessly compelling.
Absolutely.
Let's step back and look at the ground we've covered today. We have been on an incredible, rigorous journey through the darkest corridors of the mind. We started by dissecting a single, intense dream, mapping out Carl Jung's archetypes.
Watching the dreamer literally battle his own shadow in a living room.
Yeah, and confront his unattainable anima on the precipice of madness.
We then explored the Freudian mechanics, detailing how the ego builds elaborate defense mechanisms like the displacement of libido through regressive acts like tickling or structural insulation like building a dream within a dream, all just to survive the trauma of rejection.
From there, we uncovered the architectural traps of the mind, the cognitive schemas. We explored the devastating reality of the defectiveness schema, the feeling of having to illegally smuggle yourself into someone's life because your childhood blueprint tells you that you are fundamentally unworthy of walking through the front door.
We saw how the subconscious desperately warns us to stop trying to wake people who are actively pretending to sleep.
And finally, we grounded all of this grand psychological theory in the stark modern reality of neurobiology, questioning whether any of this meaning actually exists or if it's all just the forebrain synthesizing the static noise of an inflamed nervous system.
It is a massive amount of information to process.
It really is. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today. We've spent this entire time talking about the elaborate, multi-layered fictions our minds are capable of constructing while we are completely unconscious, all just to protect us from the pain of reality.
The illusions we build simply to survive the night.
Exactly. So my question for you is this. If your sleeping brain can engineer such a massive, complex lie just to shield you from the truth of a closed heart, what comfortable fictions are you actively building for yourself while you are wide awake?
Wow.
What schemas are you feeding right now without even realizing it?
That is the true razor's edge we all walk on.
It is. Because sometimes the most dangerous dreams are the ones we have with our eyes wide open, masochistically playing the heroic victim in a story where the other person has already left the stage. What experiences have you had with these hidden shadows in your dreams? Write to us in the comments of the AMSM channel.